to begin to get the first manifestations of IdeaCity dynasties. Yesterday we heard from Moshe Safdie, and now we're going to hear from his father, architect Moshe Safdie. And following Moshe, we're going to hear from Hani Rashid, an architect, where last year we heard from Karim Rashid, the industrial designer. So, Moshe, where are you?
Not as good as the other. This conference is all about change. And we learned on the first day that we're producing lots of nitrogen that's therefore making it possible to produce lots of people. And that certainly is changing the kind of problem we face as architects. Density, size, demographics, megascale. I spoke a little bit about it last year. A change in the kind of problem. Could we have a little bit more light so I could see? Change in the kind of problem that we work on as architects. But I want today to talk not about the changing problem, but what I think is more of a constant, which is the design methodology and approach that we apply to resolving architecture problems. And therefore I want to talk about evolution. Evolution, by its very word, suggests small increment of learning and improvement. And about eureka, which is those moments that a designer has a revelation or an integration in resolving these issues. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote recently that architecture is really hot these days. And I think that's true at a certain level. Does it mean that architects have increasing influence over what our built environment? Not at all. I think it's a decreasing environment. So what does it mean? It means that architecture has joined the sort of main culture of our commercial setting. Architecture is about branding. Architecture is about fashion. Architectural ideas come and go as fast as up and down the runway. There seems to be so little measure. And to just take a couple of examples, 20 years ago, at the height of postmodernism, Michael Grace built a building in Portland, Oregon, the Municipal Services Building, and it was on the cover of probably every architecture magazine, or say almost every architecture magazine. It was sort of the marvel of the day. Recently, there's discussion about demolishing it because it just doesn't work as office space. In terms of the henpecking in our star system as a fashionable idea, it's sort of totally passé. Then, about 10 years later, MoMA had an exhibition called Deconstructivism. And I remember shortly after it opened, I gave a farewell lecture at Harvard. And I sort of spoke about some ideas. And it was just after the San Francisco earthquake. And Newsweek ran these extraordinary photographs of the Nimitz Highway, totally collapsed, these sort of slabs falling one on top of the other and the reinforcing sprinkling all over the place. I reproduced the images, and in my lecture I introduced these as the work of a contemporary and spoke quite seriously about this wonderful new building. And I went on for minutes before anybody, nobody did catch on at the end. I had to say what was. And people weren't very pleased with me for doing that, but it does make you wonder about what we look at when we try to evaluate architecture. What do you look at when you try and experience and evaluate architecture? And that brings me to evolution in the sense that evolution is about fit. Evolution in the morphological sense is about the improvement of a design over time to fit its purpose. And that surely must be something totally relevant to architectural ideas and architectural concepts. And in architecture concepts, fit is complex. It's not one thing. It has to do with the life intended in a building. Now, that's a broad question, broad issue. I could take the example of Louis Kahn when he was asked to design the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and his revelation was that scientists work in groups and they work in solitude. There's the place of meditation as the place of cooperation, and the architecture bespeaks of that cooperation and meditation. Architecture has to do about place and site and the secrets of a site. Frank Lloyd Wright was asked to design a house outside Pittsburgh, and he walked around that site and he found falling water. I mean, there it is, falling water, and it became falling water. That was not just the idea of this moment, this place on the site that made it unique, but also the ideas of building stone that extends the earth, the concrete trays that cantilevered as light and weight, and so on and so forth. And architecture has to do with the method of building, and we look at the Calatrava Bridge and we see this extraordinary elegance of the resolution of the forces of gravity into something that is as elegant as a vertebra of any animal. So this is about the slow and painstaking response to, as Kahn said, what a building wants to be. Eureka, of course, is that we as architects need to be involved with that process of incremental improvement, and at the same time, we're trying to resolve many, many forces together. If I could have the slides, please. And so I don't want to show you today any specific project, but just certain moments in my own work where these things come together as a kind of and I'd like to start with a slide of a spiderweb. Actually, there's a much more beautiful one outside on the 3D photographs in the window, and just reflect on the question of evolution and fit. I mean, look at this. It's made of high tensile cables of extraordinary strength for their weight. The pattern allows the spider to weave this very efficiently, both in terms of the web that will catch the prey, but also in terms of tying it to the surrounding. And we look at this and reflect on its extraordinary beauty, but basically we are conditioned to reflect on its extraordinary fit. And the Nautilus shell has been so overused that I hesitate to use it, but again, as Darcy Thompson showed 100 years ago, the spiral, logarithmic spiral, is the only way the animal could grow with its body and house in the same proportion. This is actually the result of logarithmic nomadic growth, because that's the only way it could actually grow within its shell. When we speak about evolution in architecture, it's sort of most informative to reflect on architecture that really evolves, and this is the Friday Mosque in Isfahan. It is one of the great masterpieces of Muslim architecture. But seen here from the roof, you also reflect on the fact that this is a construction system that evolved slowly how to use brick and small stones to create great spans in a place that had no wood, and that there's a kind of a truth about this methodology of construction that is totally disarming. Years ago, when I was asked to design the National Gallery, I remember having this kind of feeling that this is about Ottawa, this is about sort of neo-Gothic Ottawa, this is about making a national gallery, reflecting on the parliamentary library. I wanted to create, on the other side of the river, some kind of a counterpoint. I also had the thought that it should be a great room, a great urban room, because museums today are not just galleries, they are places of gathering. And it seemed to me that it should be transparent, because it should be a real counterpoint to the solidity of Parliament. But then came all kinds of questions. At that point, I gave a talk at the Kennedy Library in Boston, great glass room. It was echoey, it was drenched with sun, and I felt a glass room really needs to have many lives. At winter, it's all glazed, it absorbs the sun. At summer, the sails come out and create shade. The space transforms itself like almost being under a tree in season. When it's 40 below zero and there's a dinner or a concert and the acoustics change, banners come into the space and transform it again. So this became a notion of creating spaces which change over time. There was another problem in that building. Everybody was determined that there should be daylight in the galleries, and we had no choice but to stack the galleries 2 levels. Well, how do you get daylight into the lower level? Where for years, for centuries, museums were built with skylights on the top floor and second-class space on the lower floor, except that in this building, on the lower floor would be the Canadian collection. Well, we can't have the Canadian collection without daylight, and the American and European collection with daylight. And so I'm compressing 6 months of search and models and sketches, and then at one point came the thought, why not create shafts and line them with mirror? And we made this model, and the light seemed to come right through, except all the opticians said it won't work in real-life scale. So we spent $500,000 building a mock-up, $500,000, $1982. And we built this mock-up outside Ottawa. People thought I had the new church commission in the suburbs. And there's a light shaft, which you have peaks into when you walk around the building, carrying the light down. And there's a light at the lower level, 10 meters below the top of the building, with as much light as the floor above it. When I was working in Jerusalem, as I still am, but for the first projects, I was very intimidated by building into the fabric of the old city with its extraordinary delicate scale, the architecture, again, of stone construction. And at the same time, I was thinking, how does one make meaningful open spaces in an environment which is very cold at winter or relatively cold and very hot at summer? And the thought of creating a convertible terrace, which is in part a solarium, in part open, came up. And then I started exploring that, first on the Rabbinical College, which was the first one to be built there, and then in residential construction. And we sort of, with very primitive means, created this window that slides and creates a domed glass space. It tied it into its context, but it was a total reinterpretation of the domes of the old city. And then later on, both in the old city and around the city walls in Lamela, this kind of idea started creating a kind of connection with its setting. When I came to work on the Vancouver Public Library, what I was obsessed with is that all 19th century libraries had a kind of a formula. A reading room in the middle surrounded by stacks. New York Public Library, almost every great 19th century library. And it seemed to me that this great room in the middle of a building, surrounded by stacks which are basically inactive spaces, so they present solid walls to the city, did not work in the context of a library for our own time. And the breakthrough, if I was to call it eureka, was when I thought, why not invert that? Put the stacks in the middle. They're sort of guarded by the reading room, which becomes a linear room, which is the gallery of readers. You still have a sense of the community of readers, but at the same time, it connects the readers to the city and to the stacks. And so you see in this diagram the ring of the reading gallery coming around. The urban room is not anymore the center of the library, but it's interfaced with the city. The urban room is the people of the city who use the library come and interact as they enter the library. But at the same time, you've got the intimacy of the reading gallery that surrounds the building. But from there, you go on to the questions of how you build it. And if it was not for the kind of resolution of this complex geometry into very simple, repetitive production elements, which actually made it possible to build this building in less than 2 years, in spite of its complex geometry, it would not have been possible to realize. And then there is the distribution of information, and there is the question of light, and there's the question of flexibility, which you see here with the light wells coming in between the stacks and the reading gallery. And as you know, in all contemporary buildings, we've got to get enormous volumes of air into the building and down to the machine rooms, and usually these form solid, volumes of shafts that go through the building carrying this air. But we said, why not make the light shafts, the mechanical shafts, transparent? Why not let the air come through and at the same time let the same place bring light into the building? So a technical idea and a spatial idea and a programmatic idea all come together. Last year I showed the Children's Memorial at Yad Vashem, and this year we've been working on the design and the construction of a new historic museum for Yad Vashem that will replace the existing one. It will be the same size as the Washington Museum, a Holocaust museum. And there is this beautiful but rather fragile hill. And I was thinking to myself, put a building, 2- or 3-story building on this site, and have galleries which have skylights and windows and doors to tell the story of the Holocaust. It just did not make sense to have that kind of intervention. I felt that somehow we have to find a way to make a non-building. That story could not be told in a conventional building. And I want to show you the first sketch, which was, after thinking about it for some time, that I came to the thought of cutting that museum through the mountain, entering at one end of the mountain, moving through the mountain, you can see it in the cross-section, and coming out to the other side of the mountain, so that the entire museum is invisible. It does get light from above, but basically you only see it's breaking into the mountain rather violently, and it's exploding out of the mountain towards the north. And my image of galleries was sort of inspired by this photograph of a stone quarry in Spain that has been made into a sort of park or whatever, where you wander in these stone-carved spaces with the light coming from above, which is what the galleries in this museum will be like. And you see here the museum cutting through the mountain, coming towards the north. At night, the skylight that brings light during the day becomes a line of light in the landscape. And in some sense of optimism, as you come to the end of the story, the museum, the concrete arms, 18 meters high, burst out towards the north and towards the light and the city to the north. I've been working on a museum in Salem, Mass. One of the oldest cities in the United States, and it's the oldest museum in the United States, and we are tripling its size. This is Salem today. It has this wonderful scale of New England houses along streets. And here we have to insert a museum of the scale of the AGO. Well, how do you deal with this massive building in such a delicate place? And one of the first things I did, it was right around the corner from the site, is go for a walk in the Witch Memorial Cemetery. Wonderful place with these very old stones. And then some days later, I made this sketch, which is make the museum into individual pavilions, make them into little houses of the scale of the houses of Salem. By putting them apart, you could bring light in between the houses to the galleries below. These were uncannily similar to the tombstones in the cemetery. And then they're sort of tied together by a system of glass roofs that creates courtyards and streets in between them, which then became this first model, with the glass courtyard being almost like the hull of a ship. This is the Maritime Museum. In part, that's where the seafaring people brought all their treasures from all over the world, and that's how this museum began. And then light comes in between the houses, and somehow we start relating to the scale of the houses around, to the scale of Salem. I made the mistake of showing the cemetery slide at some early presentation, and the witch connection is still haunting many on the building committee. But in fact, it doesn't really matter. What is important is there's an issue of scale, there's an issue of context of the vocabulary of forms, there's the tying of this together by these glazed spaces, and so on and so forth. And here you see the section with the upper galleries, each room unique in its geometry, and the lower galleries and the light coming through. the glass structures, and the courtyard. And finally, I'd like to touch again on a project I did show you last year, but it does tie together some of these ideas, which is the Wichita Exploration Place Science and Children Museum on this island, on this site right next to downtown. And I slipped by saying island because when I saw that site, I decided to make it into an island and cut a channel right through to put the museum on an island. These were two images that were sort of inspiring. A museum for science should speak of science. It should have a kind of inevitability to a geometry, as this 17th century, 18th century observatory in Udaipur that sort of tells you that forms in a building dedicated to science cannot be capricious. And the idea of an island as a way of maximizing the presence of water in that museum and actually putting it in the river between the two parts of the city. And the first doodle was a little model that showed an island. It took 6 months to convince the city that the highway that ran along the river should be detoured around the building. Friends of McLean's Boulevard came to being to protest the elimination of this pleasure of driving along the water through that distance. But more relevant, you can see here a measure of a sort of element of complexity of these galleries forming a ship-like building, almost like a barge coming up the river with all its goodies. But I kept feeling it was too arbitrary, it was too capricious, and started looking for some kind of a geometry that would have a cohesive wholeness about it, developing a geometry of toroidal roofs, which actually then created the geometry, the volumes of the building as we developed the plan and allowed it to intersect into that toroidal geometry, which is the surface of a bagel or a donut. And there's the model as it came out of this exercise. And with all its complexity, it is absolutely rigorous. And everything falls together once you do that. The beams are made of wood, and they're in tension, and they're efficient, and the concrete walls that go around are very stiff because their shapes resist the forces, and there is nothing superfluous. You bring it down so that everything in the building contributes to the whole. There's nothing that's applied which is not contributing in every way to the making of place. One of the galleries within, with the light coming at the point of inflection, and the building as seen from downtown along the river. So what I'd like to say in conclusion is that, if I could, is what are the criteria when we look at architecture? And what I would like to sort of emphasize today is that it seems to me that what we're really missing today as architecture gets hot is a more critical audience, that people should be much more critical about what they accept and don't accept about architecture, that people should be much more demanding, that they should not be gullible, that just because it's in every magazine does not mean that it's good or that it's right or that it's responsible. And I jotted down some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself when you look at a building or a complex of buildings. Do you really want to live in it or work in it or be in it? I mean, have a moment of truth. Would you really want to spend the rest of your life in it? And if you feel uneasy, then think about it. Does it uplift the spirit? Does it make us richer as human beings? Does it use the resources of nature efficiently and respectfully? In every respect, in terms of energy, in terms of its relationship to the elements, in terms of the way materials are used, in terms of the labor invested in it, does it really give us the most for the least, as any object in nature's design does? Does it sit harmoniously on its site? In other words, does it resonate with the site, be it a natural site or an urban site? Does it work with the buildings around it in the district so that the whole is greater than the parts? In other words, is that particular building intervention that you're looking at make the whole greater than the pieces around it? Does it contribute to the wholeness of things? That is the prerequisite of cities. If it's a school, you might say, is it a wondrous place for learning? Is it wonderful for the teachers? Is it wonderful for the students? Is it just a wonderful place to learn? And I think that if you begin having affirmative responses to some of these questions, you will recognize, I'm sure of it, beauty. And that is beauty in the most profound sense. Beauty as we recognize it in nature. Beauty which is a prerequisite for wholesome architecture. Beauty which means some level of profound truth. And in that respect, timelessness that doesn't become out of fashion. Thank you.